I have to say to you, can you hear me? Is this working? I have to say to you that I made a terrible mistake. I should have come across the country on the backs of some witches. But instead I took a plane and I caught a massive cold. So as I told the class that Michael so gently allows me to teach today, I will cough in your faces. After all, the students have been coughing in my face for 40 years, so may as well give it back to you a bit. Oh, my ear just became completely unclogged. Great, this is a good sign. I also should begin by really thanking the Virginia Tech community. I was picked at the airport by Paul Metz, driven here for 1 hour. I was picked up by Marcy the next day. I was giving a very spirited and lively tour of the campus, of your beautiful, immaculate campus, which is really quite beautiful, especially the green surrounded by all those buildings, by Sandra. Then I had lunch with 2 members of the faculty and an undergraduate student. I had dinner. I have been treated royally. This is going to get to my head, and I'm going to really believe that I am important. I also want to tell you that my name is a very difficult and a strange one. It's Teofilos, which means love of God. And as I told the other class, it's a Greek name. I am not Greek. And all my students have great difficulties because you are all taught to follow and to respect authority. But everyone calls me Teo, which means God, and you're most welcome to do the same too. But if you cannot call me by my nickname, you can call me His Highness, His Majesty, his sort of, he who his name cannot be pronounced, Voldemort, whatever you want to say. So, let us begin. I will talk for around 45 to 50 minutes. I hope I have enough energy. I assure you that I can have a great deal more energy than this. But if my energy flags, I will jump into this garbage pail. I will begin as I begin all my classes, and especially this one, which I will begin with an image. It's an image by Paul Klee entitled The New Angel, the Angelus Novus. It is, as you may say, an incredibly ghastly angel. If angels looked like this, well, I rather like devils. This is an awful angel. But Walter Benjamin, who was an essayist, a philosopher, sociologist, one of the great minds of the 20th century, wrote a series of essays in the 1930s in which he mentions this painting. And I want to evoke here 2 of those essays. Let me point out also that Walter Benjamin committed suicide outside the border of Spain in 1940 as he was fleeing Nazi Germany and not allowed to go into Spain on the way to Portugal to come to the United States. He shot himself on the head and killed himself. But there are 2 wonderful excerpts which appear in the thesis on the philosophy of history by Walter Benjamin. The first one is a critique of historicism. And he says there a few things which are important for this lecture and for my life as a historian. The first one is a commonplace. History is always written by the winners. The winners write history. Those who lose, those who are oppressed, seldom have any history. That's the first one. The second one, which I use as a kind of motto for all my courses, says, there is no monument of civilization which is not at the same time a monument of barbarity. Every great monument you see rests on the shoulders of those who, in a sense, are victimized, are exploited, and the like. So whenever we look at history, we should look at history, Walter Benjamin tells us, and brush history against the grain. That is to say, write a history that takes into account those who lost, those who are oppressed, those who are the monuments of barbarity rather than the monuments of civilization. The second excerpt is directly related to the Angelus Novus. Walter Benjamin says that he has seen the painting by Klee entitled Angelus Novus, and he likes to think of this angel as the angel of history. The angel of history stands on a hill. He looks into the past. His back is turned towards the future. In front of him, there are all the debris of history, all the catastrophes, all the genocides, all the oppressions, all the misogyny, all the awful things that happen in history, what I call in my book the terror of history. And he wants to stop and put an end to this. Come in, don't be afraid. Accounting 101? Accounting? The accounting lessons? No, witches. Yes. Oh, come in. Students are so gullible. He wants to stop. He wants to put an end to all these disasters of history, all the catastrophe. But a wind is blowing from paradise, and it has caught in his wings, and it propels him inexorably into the future. That pile of debris that piles up in front of the angel of history, Walter Benjamin says, is what we called progress. What Walter Benjamin was engaged was in a kind of critique of the Enlightenment project, on the idea that we are always going to get better, that we selectively in our courses, in our books, tend to emphasize the great monuments of civilization, neglecting, however, the monuments of barbarity. Such a monument of barbarity was the witch craze. In a period in which Europe, in a sense, created and produced the Renaissance, in a period in which Europe was launched into the scientific revolution, in a period in which great works of art were produced by artists all throughout Western Europe. In that period, running roughly from the late 15th century to around 1670s, although I learned today by one of the students here that in Scotland, the last witch trial took place in 1730. But in most of Europe, Scotland being in the peripheries of Europe, in most of Europe until 1660s, 1670s, most of the learned people in Europe, in fact, we would say almost overwhelmingly, all of them, believe that witches, people who, in a sense, had signed a pact with Satan, who gather in nocturnal gatherings where they engage in fornication, uses of phallus, human sacrifices, doing mischief and so on, were part of a great general conspiracy. And because they believe that, and because they essentially created the discourse that is going to lead to the persecution of witches, between 80 and 100,000 people in an age in which you do not have new technologies of killing, between 80 and 100,000 people, the majority of them elderly women on the margins of society, were either burned at the stake or hanged from the necks. How is that possible? How could that be believed? Some of the greatest minds in Europe in this period, Newton, some of the great thinkers, Baudin, essentially embraced this belief that there was this incredible international conspiracy of witches, that they travel on the back of devils to nocturnal gatherings, and that there they perpetrated all kinds of excesses. Newton never went to bed without looking underneath his bed to see where there was a witch hidden there that was going to do him harm. How can we believe this? And how in the 1660s, 1670, the people who have argued that not to believe in witches was heretical and in a sense a reason to be punished, ceased to believe in this as Europe in a sense entered the period which we know as the Enlightenment. What I want to do here is three things. I want to paint the context, both the intellectual and cultural context, to the witch craze. Two, I want to talk about why witchcraft and the persecution of witches came into being. And third, at the very end of the class, I want to tell you how you can become a witch, which is what you are all here. How you can acquire, in a sense, satanic powers so you can punish your teachers, get A's in your classes, and all that. Although I assure you that in organic chemistry, not even Satan can help you. Organic chemistry is the greatest contributor to the history department. Everybody comes to be a doctor, they take organic chemistry, they fail, they become historians. Isn't it true? Isn't it true? Yeah, I could see signs of recognition. I want to begin this by pointing out that in the Middle Ages, although there is an evolving discourse on witchcraft that begins with Thomas Aquinas and will culminate in the end of the 15th century, there are no systematic persecutions of people we might call witches. I also want to point out to you as well that witchcraft, which is already mentioned in the Bible, remember Saul, the king of Israel, goes to the witch of Endor to visit her in her cave. So witchcraft in Western tradition has a long history. But a great deal of what is defined as witchcraft outside of Europe is really forms of religious observance which missionaries or anthropologists from the West name as witchcraft. An example of this is, for example, the ceremonies of Santeria or Voodoo or Candomblé in Brazil, which are really religious forms which are defined by the people on top. What is this? It's a water falling down there. Which are defined essentially as forms of witchcraft. So let us essentially begin. But I will begin by pointing this out, that a great deal of the witch craze can be explained intellectually as the process of defining different areas of knowledge. In the Middle Ages, think of a rectangle, think of a big rectangle, a rectangle in which you have three elements. You have science, you have magic, and you have, how do I do that? Science, magic, and religion. In the Middle Ages, a great deal of science is also magic. In fact, it is so in the 16th century as well. A great deal of the founders of the scientific revolutions were alchemists or astrologers. In the religion, had a great deal of magic and a bit of science. And magic had a great deal of religion. All these three categories are in a sense overlapping each other. In 1486, which is when we begin our story, by 1660, these three categories will be sharply defined. Magic will be here, science will be here, and religion will be here. This is in many respects the result of the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Reformation, which redefined religion and tried to eliminate from it all the superstitious or magical elements that had crept into it throughout the Middle Ages. And science by 1660s, 1670s left magic behind. So in a sense what we have here is that the witch craze is, or the witch hunt is, to a large extent, an articulation of the manner in which fields of knowledge are defined. So that magic is incredibly important in Renaissance Italy. It plays an incredibly important role, but by the 1660s, 1670s, magic had been relegated to a form of superstition which is, in a sense, believed by or observed only by the uneducated and the lower classes. There is another point too, which is that the witch craze has a specific topography. There are witch persecutions in France. There are witch persecutions in Germany. There are witch persecutions in northern Italy, England, and Scandinavia. But no witch persecution in central and southern Italy, no witch persecution in the Iberian Peninsula. You could say, are the people in Spain more rational? Not really. But it is a reality that in the 17th century, the Grand Inquisitor goes to the Basque Country where there is reports of thousands of witches, and he dismissed the whole thing as utter sheer nonsense, which is not to be believed. You could say, tongue-in-cheek, that the Spaniards didn't need witches. They have their own targets, Muslims and Jews or conversos that can really pick on. Why witches when we have all these people that we could do harm to? So first and foremost. Second, we could also say that the end of witchcraft comes about because the rise of secular attitudes in Europe. Keith Thomas, in a magnificent, wonderful book written almost 40 years ago, which is entitled Religion and the Decline of Magic, tells us how in England, as a result of the Puritan Revolution, in a sense there is a decline in magic, whereas in other places that are either in the periphery of all these changes, or which are Catholic, such as Ireland or Scotland, there is, in a sense, an enduring presence of all these magical traditions. Moreover, I want to point out to you that in Europe, or indeed in the world to this very day, there are always two levels of religion. One is the kind of religion as very sophisticated ethical principles, believed and observed by a few, and then religion as it is observed and believed by the masses. It is remarkable how into the 21st century, religion is associated with magic to this very day. How many of you have things hanging around your neck that are, in a sense, some kind of thaumaturgical or magical objects? How many of you, give me the truth, be honest with me, when you have that incredibly difficult exam, you know that you have that favorite lucky pen that allows you to do well in the exam? Or how many of you, when you're going on a specific, wonderful, important date, you have your lucky shirt that will allow you to conquer where nothing else will conquer? The truth, isn't that true or not? Absolutely. In a sense, what we have here in the early modern period is the manner in which the people who had the higher level of religion begin to categorize and to, in a sense, dismiss other forms of popular religion, which depends on talismans, images, objects, and physicality, as not really religion, but as a form of superstition. But what were the contexts in which the witch craze took place? The first one is, of course, economic change. The late Middle Ages, the period at the end of the 15th century and at the beginning of the 16th century, saw extraordinary, rapid economic change. Any rapid economic change leads to a great deal of anxiety, and it leads a great deal of resentment. Not only the village community, which had been the mainstay of medieval Europe, is crumbling because of the rise of very wealthy merchants or urban people who are intruding into the countryside, buying commons and enclosing the lands, but you also have the rise of regional markets and so on. That's the only reason which you can explain such things as the German peasant uprising in 1525, which is triggered by a great deal of economic uncertainty. Read Thomas More, Utopia, a wonderful, magnificent work. The first half of it is really about the conditions of England around 1500. And what we see in Utopia is hundreds, thousands of peasants who have been displaced from the farms and villages, who are on the roads in England begging for money at a time in which attitude towards begging and towards the poor have been radically transformed. That in a sense, the poor are now being given lashes, thrown out of towns, incarcerated in poor houses. In some respects, this is part of what Foucault has described as the institutionalization of confinement places. The madhouse, the poor house, the prison, the kinds of institutions of modernity that try to confine people and try to force people to monitor themselves. So economies is very important because it will create a new underclass that is persecuted and that is now completely decentered from their former centers of life, the village community. The discovery of the New World and the rise of prices, this inflationary processes that come in with the importation of silver from the New World, will also have dire consequences and will rise the level of anxieties in this society. And then, of course, you have the Protestant Reformation. Luther's Protestant Reformation in the early 16th century was a radical transformation of late medieval society. The West believed to be a monolithic religious culture. And by 1520, it is severed and divided between two contending camps. Protestants on the one hand, who come under many different denominations, and Catholics in the other. As certain as you are of your religion, it is always very disturbing to know that other people believe differently from you. And although the differences are minute, the fact that there are differences is going to lead to horrific wars, sectarian wars which will be fought in Europe from the 1520s into 1648 until the Treaty of Westphalia. These are the religious wars which were often more than not political wars, but which in a sense were fought with incredible savagery and incredible violence. And for 150 years almost, Europe was consumed by warfare. The center of Europe will become essentially incredibly backward as a result of this war. It is not a coincidence that in Protestant towns, the witches are usually Catholics. And it's not a coincidence that in Catholic towns, the witches are usually Protestants. That is to say that there is a manner in which you can pinpoint religion as also an excuse for persecution. May I also point out to you that the scientific revolution, which overthrew certainties, certainly among the intellectual elites, that is to say, Europe was a world which was in flux intellectually and culturally and the like. And of course, the amazing thing about this is that witches are persecuted whether in Protestants or in Catholic countries. They are tortured in most countries, not in England, but even when there is no torture, they all confess to the same. How is that possible? The eerie similarity of confessions always lent credit to the idea that this was a great international conspiracy. Of course, the answer to that is very simple. The questions that were asked led to very specific answers. If I get you into a room and I torture you, I can get you to admit anything that I want, and I will plant into your head what I want to hear from you. This is clearly the case. And let me sort of reserve that for later. It has been argued recently, not recently, but almost 30 years ago, that one of the things that happens in Europe is that in remote areas of Europe, mostly in mountain areas of Europe, there was a survival of pre-Christian beliefs, of agricultural cults, agrarian cults, of vegetation religions and cults, which were the first religions of mankind everywhere throughout the world. Worship of trees and plants and the earth itself. This theory was dismissed in the 1920s as being totally preposterous, that there have never been such a case. But Carlo Ginzburg, who was my colleague at UCLA before he retired, showed in a book entitled The Good Walkers, the Benandanti, how in an area north of Venice called the Friuli, which is a mountain area, there were people who were born within the amniotic sac, the caul, and they wore that around their necks. And they believed, these people believed, that they were good witches, and that on specific days of the year, the amber days that were tied to, in a sense, the crops, the survival of the harvest, these people went out in a spirit, armed with fennel stalks, and they will fight the witches for the survival of the crop. And the witches were armed with sorghum stalks. Now, when the inquisitors come into the Friuli in the 16th century, and they find all these beliefs, they were not anthropologists. They didn't say, oh, well, this is the survival of pre-Christian beliefs. They thought these people were witches. And for 80 years or more, they, in a sense, questioned these people until, from the beginning, these people denied that they were witches. At the end of 80 years, they all admitted to be in consort with Satan. And this is part of the thesis of Trevor Roper, a thesis which I am a little bit reluctant to accept, which is that Europe was not began to be fully Christianized until the end of the 15th century. And at the end of the 15th century, missionaries, mostly mendicants, went into mountain areas. And in mountain areas, they found really bizarre beliefs. It was almost like California in the mountains. New Age beliefs and all kinds of nonsense. And these inquisitors these mendicant groups were absolutely shocked. Finally, it is precisely in this period and in connection with the witch hunt or witch craze that the devil acquires his personality. The devil is a strange figure. Christianity and Judaism and Islam are really religions that are children of Persian beliefs, of Zoroastrian beliefs, and Manichaean beliefs, except that neither Christianity nor Islam nor Judaism take a full Manichaean position. Manichaean is when evil and good are equally powerful, and they fight with each other for control of the soul of mankind. So in Christianity or in Judaism or Islam, it's very clear that God is more powerful than Satan. But the relationship is a strange one. I mean, read the book of Job. It's a very troubling book. There is God having coffee with Satan, with Lucifer, the angel of light, in the Starbucks in heaven, and he said, hey, look how much people likes me and loves me. Aren't they great? Look at my servant Job. He really loves me. And the devil says, yeah, because you are even giving him only A's in your classes. Of course, what is not to love? And God tells the devil, okay, you could go and have a go at it. And the devil goes and does the most abysmal things to poor Job. And he proved to be faithful. And God will eventually get him a wife and kids again and so on after all have been wiped out. So this is a strange relationship because it is a theological fact that the devil cannot tempt the witches unless he's allowed by God to do that. So what in the world is going on here? But the devil is the kind of contrary or parallel religion. In a sketch by Dürer, the devil in the early 16th century has become the stereotypical Jew, And there is a similarity in which Jews and devils will be iconographically represented in this period. Now think of the devil in Dante, this giant with three mouths, sort of eating Cassius, Judas, and Brutus, but he is submerged in, essentially, ice, whereas in the 16th century, the devil is all around. So we have here, in a sense, a context and a setting. In 1484, Pope Innocent VIII passed a bull, a decree, entitled Summa Desiderantes Affectivos, where he charged some mendicant monks, specifically two Dominican monks called Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, to go into the Jura Mountains and see what the world is going on in the mountains. They go there, they come back, and in 1486, they write and publish and print what will become the most important manual for the persecution of witches, entitled the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. And the Hammer of Witches, which you should read because it's a real fun book, and it's a kind of almost psychoanalytical examination, is divided into three parts. How can you identify a witch? How do you deal with them judicially? How can you have weapons to fight witchcraft? If you read this book, even the most partial observer will come to the conclusion that this is one of the most misogynist books ever written in. Who are the people who are most vulnerable to the devil? Women. Why? Because women are weak and given to temptations and to sinfulness. Not only do they cavort with the devil, and they are easily susceptible to the devil's wiles, but they are also engaged in the process of destroying male sexuality. And some of the things that we are told in the Malleus Maleficarum is that the witches go around and by an act of magic remove your penis from you. You could see how serious this gets. And there is a wonderful story about a priest in a small village, because witchcraft was a real rural phenomenon, with some exceptions. And a priest goes around and finds a bird's nest filled with the penises of all the villagers. And he takes one, which was the biggest one, for himself. And then he's found in the village and brought to trial and all that. So you could see how this works. You could see how, when we're not talking about the social history of witchcraft, I would mention something about this. But you could see how, in many respects, the witch craze can be interpreted partly as an attack on women. Not on every woman, but on all the women who live without men, who lived on the edges of towns, who engage in herbal cures and herbal lore, and who have other characteristics, who are midwives. Midwives get it on the neck in this witch craze. They die in large numbers. Or who repair maidenhoods, one activity in which they engage. Well, I know that there is somebody from the Spanish department, and of course the quintessential person here is La Celestina, who engages in repairing of maidenhood. Repairing of maidenhood is that if you are no longer a virgin, they will make you a virgin again. So you could see how these people are threatening. They are competing with doctors, and we know how little the doctors like competition, not only in 16th century Europe, but in 21st century America. So you are essentially creating a problem. So witchcraft has to be seen also as a sample of misogyny. And you could see that the stereotypical vision of the witch is an old woman, bent from osteoporosis, who is supposed to have the evil eye, who lives on the corner. when I was growing up, I was forbidden to go through certain streets where there were old ladies who have the evil eye. So you could see how this, in a sense, work. Now, an English historian named Alan McFarland made a large study of witchcraft in Essexshire. And he showed how, by taking the information from different trials, most of the women were beyond the age of procreation. In fact, most of the women who are executed, brought to trial and executed, were old. Most of the women were not the extreme poor one, but they were caught into a kind of in-between place between those on top and so on. We know that the people who accused them were often related to the person accused of witchcraft by marriage. It's something that many of us know very well. Your mother-in-law is a witch. My first mother-in-law was absolutely a witch. She even fly on a broom. People who engage in cursing. So how does it work? You come begging for bread in the usual traditional manner to a house at a time in which begging was really looked badly, in which the poor has become, in a sense, deprived of all the Christian attributes. You knock at the door, you come to the door, and I say, a piece of bread for the love of God. And you said to me, you witch, get out of here. You are terrible, you are ugly. And I curse you. And then you go to bed, and you cannot perform. Obviously, I am engaging in some form of witchcraft, right? It's not my fault. I'm ready. It's that witch who wished me, who in a sense bewitched me. We know also that people who are incestuous tend to be accused of witchcraft. We know that there is, as we could say, a social profile for these people. Now, what you really wanted to know, because we only have like 7 or 8 minutes, and I do want questions. You are not here just to get extra credits. The power of compulsion is extraordinary. So I want questions. I want questions about anything you might want. The question is, how do you become a witch? Please understand that all the evidence we have is essentially hostile evidence. That is to say, people who were against witchcraft and who wrote against witches. The witches never wrote. They were mostly rural people with very little knowledge. The very famous cases, somebody like Urban Grandier, his case was written by Aldous Huxley in a wonderful book entitled The Devils of Loudun, was obviously political in nature, had very little to do with religion. So how do you become a witch? In a wonderful treatise entitled Compendium Maleficarum, written in 1555 by Francesco Maria Wasso, he gives to us the breakdown of how to become a witch. The first thing is that you have to sign a pact. You have to sign a contract, which is why lawyers are really so terrible people. They're always signing contracts. You sign a contract, it could be for 24 years, it could be for your lifetime, and the pact is usually signed in your blood. It's signed in your blood. And you agree to do mischief for the devil, in return for which you get whatever you ask the devil to give you. Sex, wealth, A's in organic chemistry, your teacher breaking his legs, whatever it is that you want. But the sweetest of them all is, of course, revenge. This pact, and they are, I mean, I've never seen one, but the inquisitors say that they have seen them. And for example, Urban Grandier is supposed, or one of the nuns that have been bewitched by Urban Grandier is supposed to have vomited the pact together with some consecrated hosts and things like that. The pact is usually placed at a crossroad, main street. You put your pact there in the middle of the night, because it is suspected that the crossroads are always populated by devils, by people who come in and pick up. And which is why in Europe, all the places where several roads come in have crusaders. And Galicia, which is the terminus of the road to Compostela, is filled with witches. Meigas are called in Gallego. Second, the devil or the devil agent will imprint you with his mark. Essentially, it's a mark in the form of a toad or a bat, which will be imprinted in your armpits or in your genitalia. They are insensitive to pain and do not bleed. So there is a collection of very, sort of people that we suspect a great deal called the prickers, who go out with long needles and put a needle through your mark, and if it doesn't bleed, you are gone. It could also be a third nipple. And in fact, people are born with 3 nipples from time to time. And Bridget Bishop in Salem, which is the very end of the witch craze in a very remote area of the world, is supposed to have had a third nipple, which is used to feed your succubus or your incubus. That is to say, those demons that the devil gives you to fulfill all your sexual needs. Even though they all confess that the succubus or the incubus are always very cold. Cold to the touch, but they never get tired. So that's also very good. Mark, then you abjure your religion. You renounce to be a Christian. You cast away rosaries and scapularies. You pay homage to the devil or to his representatives. And in the trials of witches, we always get the same phrase, which obviously have been put into the mind of these people by the inquisitors, by the people who read the Malleus, and then asked the witches, which is that as they kiss the devil's behind, the devil emit a filthy and foul air. It still goes on to this very day. People essentially kissing people's behinds. So you could see how this works. Then you swear to gain followers, to attract others. You engage in a sacrilegious baptism. You get new godparents. You get a new name. The power of naming is very important. The power of words. Then you give a token to the devil. In the same manner in which we give a piece of our clothing or a piece of our hair to someone else by placing ourselves in the power. The witches those who are becoming witches will give a token to the devil. Then you go into the magic circle. You are inscribed in the devil's book. And then you are expected to make some sacrifices to the devil. May I point out to you that the accusations remain essentially the same from the beginnings of Christianity to this very day. That is to say, the same charges that are used against Christians in the first century of the Christian era, the same charges that are used against Jews afterwards, the same charges that are used against natives in the New World, are the charges that are used against witches. That they engage in cannibalism, that they, in a sense, sacrifice children, that they kill children. May I point out that the very roots of Western culture rest upon the sacrifice of the firstborn. That is anthropologically where we began. And to this very day, in very orthodox circles, your first child is symbolically always offered. Your first male child is always symbolically offered to God. And then we know that, or at least the witches are supposed to have confessed, that on certain days, which are always the eve of religious holidays, the witches gather together. The biggest and greatest gathering of witches is Walpurgisnacht, is the day before May Day, where it's like a convention. They fly from everywhere to gather in the mountains of the Jura, and they are engaged in lute dancing, uses of artificial phallus, food which is always tasteless because you cannot use salt because salt is a symbol of eternity. They drink Monsi wine, which is supposed to be an aphrodisiac, and they do all kinds of things. They do sacrifices, they make children's pies, which then were patented by McDonald's, and so on. So you could see how this works. What else can I say? They engage in ritual dancing, they bring animals, and so on. I think the final question here is, were there witches? Were there really witches? Do I believe or think that there were people who believed themselves to be witches? Yes. There are such people even to this very day. In every class I have somebody who comes and said to me, well, you know, you're talking about these witches, but I am really a witch. I am a Wicca witch. Okay, thank you. That and $1.50 will get me into the bus in Los Angeles. Where there are people on top who believe that they were witches? Yes. Did some of these poor women who were brought to trial eventually came to adopt the reality, the discourse of those on top? Yes. Jean de Lumont, many years ago, wrote a book which is called The Fear in the West, in the manner in which scapegoating, specifically the scapegoating of all women who were in a surplus in Europe during this period, was used by governments to, in a sense, misdirect concern with things like the economy, war, mismanagement, misgovernment, to certainly vulnerable, defenseless group in society who could be picked up at will and exterminated. So at the end, this is what the witch craze was. You could see all the images that you see that appear with the manuals of witchcraft, of which there are zillions of them written in this period, or witches being essentially burned at the stake in Germany in 1533, or witches represented as very old women, always with black cats and other animals, or the manner in which history is always a kind of evocation of the great Greek myth of Saturn eating his children, Saturn devouring his children. In the same manner in which time eats us all, I said that in the class this morning, history devours us as well. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to lay down on the floor now and answer questions while laying down. Now, tell me, what do you want to, what questions? Questions, please. Oh, yes. Great. Never mind.
I was just, what was the name of the book that
The Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches.
Okay.
Written by Jacob Sprenger and Heinrich Kramer. Two Dominican monks, Germans, obviously. Another question, please. I cannot hear. It's something that happens with age. You hear less, you see less, and huge amounts of wine doesn't help either. Galicia is a Celtic homeland. And if you go to Galicia to this very day, you see the presence of the Celts. In fact, we know that the majority of the people who live in Great Britain today migrated to the British Isles from Galicia and from Brittany. So that there is this deep Celtic tradition that is still very much alive. Music, monuments, Druid religion. The Celts were particularly gifted in creating and inventing a world of fairies, magic, and so on. So there are no persecutions against witches in Galicia, ever. But there is a long, long tradition of Galicia being a land of magas, which is the word in Gallego, of witches. although they are less, in a sense, malefic witches. They are more, tend to be herb, lore, cures, and love. I don't know that I answered your question, but questions, please. Yes, who is asking? Ah, there, two of you at the same time. Jose, you go first. Okay.
What would witches usually be accused of other than being a witch? Would they be accused of a certain crime against somebody?
They are accused of the worst of all possible crimes. Because the witches' crime was a crime not only against religion, they have allied themselves with Satan. They have accepted Satan as their God. But it was a crime against government, which is why throughout the early modern period, there is this unholy alliance of religion and politics. So they are traitors to everybody else, because what they want to do is to undermine society.
With the traditions of the pact with the devil, are they all meant to be kind of satanic parallels to civil or religious traditions?
Absolutely. I don't believe that these things existed. I believe that they are imagined by the elite and created as a manner of persecuting people. So the witches engage in a kind of reverse parallel of religious practices. They conduct satanic masses, which is everything in reverse. You make the sign of a cross in reverse. All kinds of things that, in a sense, will make clear that these people are alien to the general society and should be destroyed. The question which is begging here is, why did it stop? Why the same people who the year before were absolutely vociferously claiming to put down the witches suddenly decided this is sheer nonsense?
Let's say 100 women were charged with witchcraft. How many would actually be convicted or given punishment?
That is a very good question. The Inquisition, certainly in Catholic countries, but in other places as well, was very meticulous and careful. So accusations of witchcraft will have to be verified. You will be giving opportunities to list all the people who you think are your enemies. And those testimonies are not valid. And not everyone is burned. Some people are admonished, given little penalties and so on. The problem with this, the Inquisition is very thorough. Now, inquisitorial records, which are the best records in 16th century and 17th century Europe, have to be read with a great deal of caution, because what you're seeing is the voice of the inquisitor. Very often, the inquisitors did not understand the language that the people they brought to trial spoke, and vice versa. But the reality is that what is important is not so much how many people are really charged and executed at the first go, is that once you have been brought up on charges, you cannot fail again. This is the case of Menocchio, a miller in a town in Italy, which Carlo Ginzburg has also studied, who had the most bizarre ideas. He believed that the world was made of cheese. And like in the cheese, microbe and bacteria grew by itself, so that there was no God, things self-generated. The Inquisition brought him to charges, questioned him extensively, punished him by having to wear a specific ritual dress in his village. And then eventually he went back to arguing what he was arguing. Menocchio is a very not typical, because he read and he had books. The second time around, he was executed. So you could see.
Orthodox Christians make the sign of the cross backwards.
Pardon me?
Orthodox Christians make the sign of the cross backwards.
The Orthodox Christians make the sign of the cross Actually, they make the sign of the cross differently. No, but they actually, the difference between Orthodox and, the sign of the cross is like this. What it is that Orthodox Christians use 3 fingers instead of 2.
Well, they do it the other way.
Ah, well, I stand corrected. Yeah. Well, you must also understand one thing. By 1486, when the Malleus is written, the Orthodox Christians in the East are beyond the pale. In fact, the Ottomans, something that I forgot to say, the Ottoman threat was also another thing that added to the anxieties of the period. So by this period, the Orthodox in the East are like, they should be all killed because there was an attempt to convert to Catholic Christianity in 1453, and the people as a whole rejected that. I'm sorry, I'm coming to you. I'm coming to you. Yes?
Since you pointed to some economic reasons to use, and of course burden state some witches, do we have any idea how many of the witches that have been burned were actually midwives and were in a kind of jeopardizing the medical business?
We have no hard data. In fact, I gave a very big figure between 80 and 100. We have no hard data on how many midwives out of this group, because some of the records have not survived, especially in the north. But we know that when we have evidence, midwives are really represented in large numbers. Half of all the children who were born died before the age of 1. And since there was a belief that children were used for sacrifices and so on, the midwives were supposed to have killed the children and brought the bodies for cannibalism and things like that. May I also point out that cannibalism and the murder of children, cannibalism was not unknown in the West. And there is compelling evidence to point out that when Dante was writing the Divine Comedy, they might have been, and there was a great famine in Northern Europe running from Ireland to the Urals, that there might have been some people who were cannibalized out of hunger. So that's, and second, that children are murdered in large number in periods of famine, scarcity. Hansel and Gretel's story is really a folk memory of children being abandoned in the forest where witches lived that turned them into pies. So you could see how this is something that is part of the folklore and memory of Europeans. Parricide, the killing of your elderly parents, really goes on in Europe into the 19th century. It's only after the agricultural revolution in Western Europe that many of these practices cease. May I also remind you, those of you who are Catholic in this room, that you engage in an actual eating of flesh and drinking of blood whenever you have communion. It's not a symbolic reenactment. It is an actual flesh, an actual blood that you are eating and drinking. There was another question here.
So this firstborn child sacrifice kind of narrative that you strung along with, the witch trial narrative, that kind of runs parallel to it, but it's a bigger issue. What is that doing any work for your account, or is that just kind of icing?
No, what I mean to say is that there is a kind of almost belief. What is the covenant? The covenant is you don't have to kill your child now. What are we being told here is that the first child is offered to the gods or to God, and Western literature is crawling with examples of the sacrifice of a child to appease the gods.
So you see it as like, it's easy
To try to
fodder
go,
to appeal to
Yeah.
in this case because it's
something
so
that is
fluid
belief,
in the-
is part of human consciousness in the West. And therefore to accuse witches of doing this is very believable.
So why did it stop? Why did the witch craze stop?
Why did the witchcraft stop? Education, science, the triumph of capitalism. At the beginning is the embryonic capitalism creates tensions. By 1660, 1670, it's a world economy, it's a global economy. Science have triumphed. In the early 17th century, somebody named Kosovan shows philologically that the Hermetic tradition is fake, it's nonsense, that it was written in the 2nd century. And that really weakens the elite understanding of magic. So, secularism, Europe becomes secular. By the next century, which is the Enlightenment, Europe, religion takes a second rank to science, discoveries, the Enlightenment. The end of superstition, then or now, is also education.
Is there any analogous history of persecution of supposed witches elsewhere?
Yes,
outside
and it's very odd, because in Lithuania there are great witch persecutions, but the targets there are males, and I think it has to do with demography. In the West there was this incredible surplus of women, especially elderly women, who had abandoned their households and gone to live on the side because of the religious wars that killed so many males. In Lithuania, something, I don't know enough about the Lithuanian situation, but in Lithuania there is witch hunts, but it's mostly males who get it on the neck. And of course there are still witch hunts in Africa, for example. And European colonizers engage in a conscious definition of other people's religious practices as forms of witchcraft. Why? Because it legitimizes conquest. I mean, now think for a second. The most spiritual country in the world is India. 500 BCE, it produces the Maharivi, the Jain religion, which is about the most superior of all religions because no harm to anyone, no harm to even insects, no harm to even bedbugs. Buddha is writing in this period. So this is a country with an incredible tradition of spirituality. But when the British get there, how could you justify the conquest of these people? Well, look at that, they burned their wives. They worship many gods. The whole idea that monotheism is superior to polytheism, well, I don't buy it. I don't believe in God, but if I were to believe in God, I want 400 gods. Okay, my coal, a god for my coal, a god for my plane ride back to LA, a god for my exams in organic chemistry. Hey, that's more manageable, isn't it?
Could you talk a little bit about the trials themselves and maybe how they rise some of these confessions?
I'm sorry. Let's say that the trial is taking place in Catholic Germany, or in Catholic France, or in Catholic Italy in the north, or in Protestant Germany, or in Protestant France. We will bring you to trial. We will ask you, there are these accusations. You were seen going in the evening into the clearing on the woods and dancing there naked and things like that. Is this true? Me? I am a wonderful student at Virginia Tech. I haven't done any of this. And they keep asking you, isn't it true that you sold your soul to the devil? And they keep questioning you. And you refuse to confess. And then we torture you a little bit. But confessions under torture are not admissible. So we let you recover. And then we ask you again. And then we torture you again. By this time, you're ready to confess to anything. I asked in the other class, how many of you have read 1984? Yeah. Think about the process by which Winston Smith is made not only to confess to everything right away when they beat the hell out of him, but also after continuous questioning. And this is the key here. Not just to confess to avoid being punished, but to actually believe what you have confessed, which is at the very essence of control. To actually make you believe that what you confess is true. Because the church and government, and this applies both to Protestants and Catholics alike, are engaged in a very nefarious plot to exclude you from society, but to reinsert you into the social body as well. It's not good enough that you confess. You must ask for forgiveness. You must acknowledge your sins. And therefore, when you do that, you validate and legitimize the structures of power. Isn't it? You become complicit into your own punishment because you deserve it. These are the kind of psychological games that are still played to this very day by parents, for example. Such a naughty child, you deserve to be punished. And then you begin to internalize the fact that you are a naughty child and you deserve to be punished. There are dire consequences to that.